Welcome to Velvet Chronicles, where every secret changes destiny. Tonight's story begins. Everyone knows that London society is nothing more than a well-dressed meat market, where young women parade in silk while lords calculate dowries with the cold precision of bankers, and yet on the night of the most anticipated ball of the season, Marcus Ashworth, Duke of Rosemere, could not bring himself to look at a single one of the beauties circling his ballroom floor, because he was standing in the shadows of the mezzanine balcony, utterly captivated by the one woman in the entire glittering crowd who wanted absolutely nothing from him, and instead of chasing his fortune, she had reached for the hand of his younger brother, the brother society mocked, the brother she treated like a king. The Rosemere house ballroom that evening smelled of melting beeswax, crushed lilies, and quiet desperation. Eleanor Hartley stood near a towering marble pillar, pressing her shoulder against the cool stone to steady herself against the dizzying swirl of silk and gossip. Her corset laced a fraction too tight, a silent reprimand from her Aunt Constance that she was 22, possessed a painfully modest dowry, and was rapidly running out of time. The heat of 500 bodies pressed beneath 3 enormous chandeliers was suffocating. Silk rustled against silk, fans snapped open with the sharp rhythmic crack of musket fire, and Eleanor watched the endless rotation of the waltz with her face arranged into the pleasant, vacant mask required of every unmarried woman in the room, though she despised every second of it, despised the painted smiles and practiced titters, despised the men whose eyes darted to necklines while their minds calculated bank balances. "Stand up straight, Eleanor," her aunt hissed without ever looking away from the dance floor. "Lord Pemberton is glancing this way." But Eleanor did not adjust her posture, because she knew precisely what Lord Pemberton was looking at, and it was not her slightly outdated pale green gown. His gaze, sharp and cruel, was fixed instead on the far side of the room, near the orchestra, where above the swirling crowd, shrouded in the dim light of the second-floor mezzanine, stood Marcus Ashworth himself, the architect of this entire glittering menagerie, though he looked as though he would rather burn the house down than host another dance. He leaned heavily against the marble balustrade, a half-empty glass of amber liquid dangling from long, tense fingers, dressed in stark black evening clothes that refused the flashy waistcoats favored by younger lords, his face a study in hard lines, a sharp jaw, a straight nose, eyes so dark daughters into his path like sacrificial offerings, and he played the game by refusing to participate, remaining above them, untouchable, except his eyes were not sweeping the crowd for a bride, they were fixed and unwavering on a single figure standing dangerously close to the cellists. That figure was Julian, 20 years old, possessing the broad shoulders and towering height of every Ashworth man, but his posture was all wrong. He slouched, his weight shifting from foot to foot in an anxious, restless rhythm, his cravat already crooked, his thick dark hair falling into his eyes, and his mind, as the tongues so delicately whispered behind their fans, was broken, for he possessed the intellect of a 7-year-old child. Loud noises frightened him, complex sentences confused him, and he loved the vibrations of the cello, the taste of lemon ice, and the intricate gears of pocket watches, and society tolerated him only because of his brother's immense wealth and power, though tolerance was a thin, brittle veneer stretched over cruelty. Marcus gripped the cold marble of the railing, hating that he had brought Julian to this at all, hating the way the crowd parted around his brother like water around a diseased rock. But Julian had begged, he had heard the musicians tuning their instruments that very afternoon and wept because he wanted so badly to feel the music, and Marcus could never deny him that. "Just stay near the wall, Ollie," Marcus thought, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle ticked in his cheek. "Stay quiet. Let them ignore you." But society is rarely content to merely ignore weakness, it prefers to pick at it like a scab, and down on the floor, Lord Pemberton leaned in to whisper something to a cluster of young bucks, who snickered, their eyes darting toward Julian, and Pemberton adjusted his cuffs with a sly, ugly smile before beginning to weave his way through the crowd toward the orchestra. Eleanor saw it happen before anyone else did, so the exact trajectory of his approach felt a cold, hard knot forming in her stomach, because the ton was a meat market, yes, but it was also a wolf pack, and the wolves had just found the straggler. Julian was swaying, entirely unaware of the 5-foot radius of empty floor the crowd had given him, consumed instead by the low, mournful drag of the bow across the cello's thickest string, his eyes closed, his large hands tapping an erratic, joyful rhythm against his thighs, and Pemberton approached the vacuum without walking directly at him. That would have been too obvious. Instead stepping backward as though engrossed in conversation with his companions, drifting closer and closer to the swaying, oblivious young man with a glass of dark red punch in hand. Eleanor pushed off the marble pillar. "Eleanor, where are you going?" Aunt Constance snapped, catching a fistful of pale green silk. "I need some air, Aunt," Eleanor said, slipping her skirt from the older woman's grasp, and though she did not run, running was forbidden after all, her strides were long, purposeful, and entirely unladylike. She did not know the Duke's brother personally, she had only heard the rumors, the cruel jokes passed in drawing rooms about the Rosemere idiot, the Duke's heavy cross to bear, but looking at Julian now, she did not see an idiot at all. She saw a boy trapped inside a man's body, entirely exposed to a room full of wolves. On the balcony, Marcus set his glass down on the stone ledge with a dull clink, seeing Pemberton's maneuver for exactly what it was, the spilled drink, the feigned apology, the public humiliation designed to provoke a meltdown from Julian for the evening's entertainment, and he stepped away from the railing, moving toward the shadows of the staircase, prepared to break Pemberton's jaw. Scandal be damned, but before he reached the first step, Pemberton bumped hard into Julian, who stumbled forward in shock, catching his balance just as Pemberton let out an exaggerated shout and the red punch splashed violently across Julian's pale grey waistcoat, blooming like a massive, ugly bloodstain. The music faltered for half a second before the cellist hastily picked up the tempo again, and silence rippled outward from the epicenter of the collision, heads turning, fans stilling mid-wave. "Good God, man," Pemberton declared loudly, brushing his own perfectly dry sleeves. "Watch where you throw yourself, you very nearly ruined my coat," and Julian stared down at the crimson stain blooming across his chest, his breath hitching, his large hands hovering over the wet fabric, trembling, because he hated feeling sticky, hated sudden loud voices, and he looked around wildly, his chest heaving, the beginnings of panic tightening his throat as he searched for the stairs, searched for Marcus, while the cluster of young men behind Pemberton muffled their laughter behind gloved hands and someone muttered that perhaps the nursery was missing its favorite pupil. Marcus's boot had just hit the top step of the sweeping staircase, blood roaring in his ears, when a flash of pale green cut through the crowd. Eleanor stepped directly into the vacuum, not looking at Pemberton, not looking at the whispering onlookers, stepping squarely in front of Julian to block his view of the laughing men, forcing him instead to look down at her. "It is entirely my fault," Eleanor said, her voice not loud but carrying a clear, sharp cadence over the hushed whispers as she pulled a pristine white lace handkerchief from her reticule. Julian blinked at her, his breathing ragged. "So sticky," he stammered, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that contrasted sharply with his frightened tone. "It is sticky, I know," Eleanor agreed, refusing the high-pitched, condescending tone people reserved for children and dogs, speaking to him instead evenly, firmly. "Punch is terribly sticky, but it has not stained your shirt, my lord, only the waistcoat." Pemberton stepped forward, his face flushing with irritation at the interruption. "Miss Hartley, I assure you the fault lies entirely with," but Eleanor turned her head and looked at him with eyes so cold and profoundly unimpressed that the man actually closed his mouth. "Lord Pemberton," she said flatly, "you appear to have lost your spatial awareness. Perhaps you should visit the terrace. The heat seems to be affecting your balance." A few sharp gasps echoed from the nearby matrons, because to speak to a titled gentleman in such a manner was social suicide for an undowered girl, but Eleanor did not care. The ink on her marriage prospects could burn for all she was concerned, and she turned her back on Pemberton, a deliberate, brutal dismissal, focusing entirely on Julian instead, reaching out slowly so he could see her hand coming and gently pressing the handkerchief against the worst of the stain on his chest. He flinched at first, but she did not retreat, keeping her touch light and predictable. Halfway down the staircase, frozen in the shadows, Marcus stopped, his hand hovering over the banister as he watched the girl in the outdated green dress, a girl whose name he knew, Miss Hartley, a nobody, a wallflower, because opportunists threw themselves at his feet daily, yet they avoided Julian like a plague, and if they acknowledged him at all it was with thinly veiled disgust or exaggerated, sickening pity. But this girl was not looking up at the balcony to see whether the Duke was watching her act of charity. She was not looking at anyone at all. She was looking at Julian's waistcoat, folding the sticky handkerchief into a neat square. "Better?" she asked him. Julian looked down, the wetness still there though the dripping had stopped, and looked back at her, his panic receding into cautious curiosity. "Yes, thank you, it is cold, it is," she agreed, "but the cellos are warm. I was watching you from across the room. You feel the music quite deeply, do you not? Julian's eyes lit up, the transformation instantaneous, the fear melting away to reveal a boyish, unguarded joy that made him suddenly strikingly handsome. The big wooden one, it rumbles here, he said, tapping his chest just above the stain. It vibrates the floor. It does, Eleanor smiled, the first real smile she had worn all evening, transforming her face from plain to something arresting. I have always thought the cello is the only instrument that truly understands melancholy. Julian frowned slightly, tasting the word. Melancholy, sadness, yes, but a beautiful sadness. The orchestra, having recovered from the disruption, shifted into the opening chords of a slower, sweeping waltz, and the crowd around them, deprived of their disaster, began to murmur and drift back toward the dance floor. Eleanor knew she should walk away. She had caused a scene, insulted an earl's son, likely ruined her season entirely, but she looked at Julian, watched his shoulders slump as he realized he was once again relegated to the role of invisible spectator, and thought, damn them, damn every single one of them. She looked up into his eyes. My lord, she said, her voice steady, I find myself without a partner for this waltz, and I abhor standing still when the cellos are playing so beautifully. Would you do me the honor of dancing with me? And she offered her bare, gloveless hand. Julian stared at it, his large hands calloused from working in the gardens at the family's country estate, the only place he was truly allowed to roam free, and looked from her small pale hand up to her face, panic flaring again. I do not know the steps, he whispered. Marcus says I step on toes. I am clumsy. I am entirely indifferent to my toes, Eleanor replied, keeping her hand extended, and a waltz is only walking in circles, my lord. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, if you can count to 3, you can waltz. On the staircase, Marcus felt his lungs seize. Don't do this, he thought, a dark, cynical panic rising in his chest. Don't build him up only to let him fall. When he stumbles they will laugh and it will break him. And he wanted to stride down and intervene, wanted to shield his brother from the inevitable humiliation, but something rooted him to the spot, the way Miss Hartley held her hand out, not as a demand but as an offering, unwavering, patient. Julian looked at the floor, swallowed hard, and then, with an agonizing slowness, reached out, his massive, warm hand enveloping hers, his grip entirely too tight, lacking the refined gentleness of a practiced gentleman. But Eleanor did not wince. She stepped into him, forcing him into the traditional frame, placing his right hand firmly on her waist. Hold me here, she instructed softly. Do not let go. I will guide you. People are looking, Julian whispered, trembling violently now. Let them look, Eleanor said fiercely, her eyes locking onto his. They are looking because they are bored, miserable creatures who do not know how to feel the music. Focus on the cello, focus on me. 1, 2, 3. The music swelled. Eleanor took the definitive backward step, pulling Julian with her, and he stumbled, his heavy boot landing squarely on the hem of her gown with a sickening rip of silk, a collective gasp echoing from the nearest onlookers. Pemberton smirking, Marcus gripping the banister so hard the wood groaned, but Eleanor did not miss a beat, did not look down at her ruined hem, tightening her grip on Julian's shoulder instead, her nails digging slightly into his jacket to ground him. Perfect, she lied smoothly, now the left foot, 1, 2, 3, and she pushed him, her frame surprisingly strong, forcing him to shift his weight, and he stepped, and did not step on her this time. Good, again, 1, 2, 3, and they began to turn. It was not a graceful waltz, it lacked the smooth, gliding, effortless quality of the ton's most celebrated dancers. Julian moved like a draft horse forced into a dressage arena, stiff, heavy, terrified, staring down at his own feet, his brow furrowed in intense concentration, his mouth silently forming the numbers, 1, 2, 3, but they were turning, and Eleanor kept her head high, refusing to look at the crowd, keeping her gaze fixed on Julian's chin, speaking in a low, constant stream of encouragement. You are doing wonderfully. Feel the turn. Let the music push you. That's it. 1, 2, 3. Slowly, the violent trembling in his arm began to ease. The rigid terror in his shoulders softened. He stopped staring at his feet, looked up past Eleanor's head toward the orchestra, heard the cello, and his steps, previously disjointed and harsh, began to find the rhythm. He was still heavy, still utterly lacking in finesse, but he was no longer fighting the music. He was moving with it, and a breathless, tentative smile broke across his face. I am dancing, he whispered, his deep voice colouring with wonder. "You are dancing, Lord Julian," Eleanor confirmed, a genuine warmth flooding her chest, and they rotated past the centre of the room, the sea of silk and broadcloth parting for them, not out of respect but out of shock, because it was unprecedented. The Duke's simple brother, the great embarrassment of the Ashworth line, was waltzing with a woman in a ruined dress who carried herself with the bearing of a queen. From the shadows of the staircase, Marcus watched, his cynical shell, hardened by years of defending his brother against the veiled cruelty of the world, finally beginning to fracture. He watched Julian smile, a real, unrestrained smile in the middle of a London ballroom, watched the woman in the pale green gown absorb the brunt of the ton's judgment without flinching, transmuting Julian's awkwardness into dignity, and realized he had stopped breathing entirely, the bitter taste of brandy fading from his tongue, replaced by something entirely unfamiliar, hope, a sharp, terrifying spike of gratitude. As the waltz reached its final soaring crescendo, Eleanor guided Julian into a slow, deliberate halt, letting the music fade completely before stepping back. Julian was flushed, chest heaving, eyes wide and bright. "I did not step on your toes again," he said. "No," Eleanor smiled, executing a perfect deep curtsy. "You are a flawless partner, my lord," and Julian gave a clumsy, overly deep bow in return. When Eleanor rose from her curtsy, her eyes drifted upward, an instinct she had not meant to follow, a sudden pull of awareness through the massive crystal droplets of the chandeliers, past the staring eyes of the crowd, and her gaze caught the shadows of the staircase, where Marcus stood now fully visible, having descended halfway down the steps, not looking at the crowd, not wearing his customary mask of deadened apathy, looking directly at her instead. And though the distance between them was immense, filled with the noise of polite applause and vicious whispers, Eleanor felt the weight of his stare like a physical touch, no anger in his dark eyes, only a burning, intense focus that made the breath catch in her throat. For a single suspended second, the Duke of Rosemere and the ruined wallflower held each other's gaze, and then the orchestra struck up a lively country dance, the spell broke, and the meat market resumed its chaotic swirl. The carriage ride back to the Hartley townhouse was suffocating. Aunt Constance did not speak for the first 20 minutes, sitting rigidly on the worn velvet squabs, her profile illuminated in harsh flashes by the passing street lamps, the silence heavier than any physical blow, the silence of a ledger being closed, a bankruptcy finalized. Eleanor stared at her lap, her hands resting over the jagged taille in her pale green silk skirt, the frayed edges a tangible symbol of her ruined prospects. The adrenaline that had propelled her across the ballroom floor now entirely evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. "Do you have any conception?" Aunt Constance finally said, her voice a thin, vibrating wire of contained fury, "of what you have done?" Diana did not look up. "I prevented a cruelty, Aunt." "You committed social suicide," Constance snapped, abandoning her rigid posture to lean forward, her eyes wide and manic. "You insulted the son of an earl, you made a spectacle of yourself with that creature. You are 22, Eleanor. We do not have the funds to weather a scandal, we do not have the family name to force people to forget. By tomorrow afternoon the patronesses will have crossed your name from their books. We are finished." Eleanor turned her head to look out the window at Cobblestone slick with a fine London drizzle, knowing full well that Constance was right, that the mechanics of their society were ruthless, that one either possessed capital or reputation, and she had just spent the last of her reputation on a boy who could not tie his own cravat, and yet in the dark of the carriage she could still feel the phantom weight of Julian's trembling hand, could still see the unguarded joy in his eyes when he realized he was actually dancing. "I am sorry for the embarrassment I have caused you, Aunt," Eleanor said quietly, "but I am not sorry for the dance," and Constance let out a sharp, breathless sound of disbelief and sank back against the cushions, saying nothing more for the rest of the journey. Back at Rosemere House, the ball raged on, a glittering machine running on champagne and gossip, though the atmosphere near the terrace doors had plummeted in temperature, Lord Pemberton holding court over the incident among his circle of sycophants, a fresh glass of punch in hand, inflating his own wit with every retelling of the Duke's clumsy brother, never noticing Marcus approach. Marcus did not stride, he stalked, moving with the quiet, lethal economy of a man who had spent his entire life containing violence, the crowd parting instinctively, laughter dying on lips as they registered the expression on the Duke's face. Pemberton realized his audience had gone silent, turned, a smirk still half formed on his mouth, and found Marcus standing less than a foot away, taller, broader, the sheer physical mass of him intimidating, though it was his eyes, entirely blank, devoid of anger, devoid of anything human, that made Pemberton take an involuntary step backward. "Your Grace," he stammered, the smirk vanishing. Marcus did not acknowledge the greeting, reaching out instead with a smooth, deliberate movement to pluck the crystal glass of punch from Pemberton's hand, holding it between them. "A clumsy thing, a spilled drink," Marcus said, his voice barely a whisper, meant only for Pemberton and the terrified men standing immediately behind him. "It was an accident, Your Grace," Pemberton said, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. "The fellow stumbled into me. He is entirely unpredictable." "My brother is exactly as predictable as I am, Pemberton." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "He simply lacks my restraint," and he opened his hand, letting the crystal glass drop, shattering against the polished oak floorboards with a sharp, violent crack, red punch splattering across Pemberton's white silk stockings. "Your father's shipping contracts in the West Indies require renewal next month," Marcus said softly. "They require my signature in the House of Lords. I will not sign them." Pemberton's mouth dropped open, colour draining entirely from his face. "Your Grace, please, you cannot penalize my family's estate for a trivial ballroom misunderstanding." "It is not a misunderstanding, it is a lesson in spatial awareness," Marcus replied flatly. "Consider your season over, Pemberton. If I see your face at another event my family attends, I will not stop at your father's ships. I will bankrupt your entire line. Now get out of my house." Pemberton swallowed hard, looked at the shattered glass, then at the Duke's immovable face, and turned to walk quickly toward the exit, leaving faint red footprints on the floorboards behind him. Marcus watched him go, feeling no satisfaction, the rage inside him a cold, deep lake that sinking one insignificant lord did nothing to drain, and he turned his gaze toward the grand entrance, tracing the path the girl in the green dress had taken an hour ago. Eleanor Hartley. He needed to know exactly who she was. Morning light was merciless to the Hartley drawing room, highlighting the faded patches on the Persian rug and the layer of dust on the mantelpiece that the single overworked maid had not the time to address. Eleanor sat by the window, a sewing basket on her lap, methodically unpicking the stitches of her ruined silk hem, the dress unsalvageable as a ball gown, but perhaps, if she was careful, enough fabric remained to make it into a day dress. She worked in silence. Aunt Constance had taken to her bed with a migraine, declaring they were ruined and she wished to be dead, or at the very least asleep, until next Tuesday. The heavy brass knocker on the front door sounded with 3 sharp, authoritative strikes. Eleanor paused, her needle hovering over a thread. They were not expecting callers, certainly not at 10 in the morning, and certainly not the morning after a social disaster. She heard the maid's hurried footsteps in the hall, the squeak of the front door hinges, and then a low, masculine murmur that made the floorboards vibrate, and a moment later the maid appeared in the doorway, eyes round as saucers, cap slightly askew, holding a silver tray as though it were a live grenade, a single heavy cardstock embossed with a crest resting upon it. "Miss," the maid squeaked, "the Duke of Rosemere." Eleanor stared at the card, her pulse spiking into a sudden erratic flutter against her ribs, and she set the sewing basket down on the floor. "Show him in, Mary." She stood, smoothed the front of her simple muslin day dress, checked her hair knowing full well several strands had escaped their pins, and decided she did not care. If he had come to deliver a reprimand on behalf of his family's honor, she would face him on her feet. Marcus stepped into the drawing room, seeming far too large for the space, his broad shoulders nearly blocking the doorway, his head narrowly clearing the hanging chandelier, dressed for riding in a dark coat and immaculate boots that smelled faintly of leather and cold morning air, a riding crop in one hand, looking altogether dangerous. He stopped a few feet from her, his dark eye sweeping over the faded room, the sewing basket, and finally settling on her face. Eleanor did not curtsy, it felt absurd in her own home, and simply held his gaze. "Your Grace," she said, her voice steady though her hands had gone cold, "this is a highly irregular hour for a call." "I am not interested in regular hours, Miss Hartley," Marcus replied, his voice the same gravelly baritone as his brother's but hardened, stripped of all vulnerability. "I am interested in answers." "Answers to what?" Eleanor asked. "To what you were attempting to achieve last night," Marcus said, walking slowly toward the fireplace, his boots loud on the hardwood floor, turning to face her once he reached it. People do not risk their reputations for nothing. In my experience, charity is always a transaction. What did you hope to gain by latching yourself onto Julian? Did you think to draw my attention, to play the martyr? The sheer arrogance of the accusation knocked the breath out of her for a second, and then a hot, searing anger flared in her chest. You flatter yourself, Your Grace, Eleanor said, her voice dropping a register, cold and sharp as cracked ice. Your attention was the absolute furthest thing from my mind. I saw a boy panicking because a vicious coward had spilled a drink on him. I intervened because everyone else in the godforsaken ballroom was too busy staring to offer a handkerchief. She stepped closer, entirely forgetting the social gulf between them. Do not project the cynical calculations of your peers onto me. I danced with your brother because he heard the cello and wanted to dance. If you cannot understand a motive simpler than social climbing, that is a failure of your imagination, not a flaw in my character. Silence stretched between them, thick and electric. Marcus stared at her, studying the flush of anger high on her cheeks, the fierce, unapologetic set of her jaw, and no one spoke to him this way. Men cowered, women calculated, but this girl in a faded dress, holding a ruined hem, was taking him to task in her own dusty drawing room, and the cold lake of rage inside him shifted. I ruined Pemberton, Marcus said quietly. Eleanor blinked, caught off guard by the non sequitur. What? Last night I made it clear that if he remains in London I will financially dismantle his family. He left town this morning. Eleanor absorbed this, looked at the heavy riding crop in his hand, the tension in his shoulders, and realized suddenly that this formidable, terrifying man was fundamentally exhausted, carrying a shield so heavy it was breaking his own back. That was unnecessary, she said softly. It was entirely necessary, Marcus countered, his jaw tightening, but it does not solve your problem. I am aware of how the ton operates. You publicly humiliated a wealthy heir and danced with the family's pariah. You are currently the subject of 50 different morning calls and none of them are complimentary. You will be ostracized. I am aware. I will not allow Julian's joy to be the instrument of your ruin. Marcus stepped forward, the sheer proximity of him making Eleanor's breath catch. He smelled of horsehair, expensive soap, and raw power. Tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock, I will send my carriage for you and your aunt, he said, his tone turning to pure command. You will drive with me in Hyde Park in the open barouche at the height of the promenade. Eleanor stared at him, understanding immediately that driving in Hyde Park with the Duke of Rosemere was the highest social elevation a woman could achieve, a public declaration of his favor. It would instantly obliterate any gossip Pemberton had seeded. It would make her untouchable. You do not need to pay me for my kindness, Your Grace, Eleanor said, her pride stiffening her spine. I am not a mercenary. It is not payment, Marcus said, his eyes darkening, fixing on her mouth for a fraction of a second before snapping back to her eyes. It is a consequence. You wanted to drag my brother into the light. Now you must deal with the glare. Be ready at 3. And he did not wait for her agreement, turning on his heel and striding out of the drawing room, the front door closing with a decisive, heavy thud. Eleanor stood alone in the quiet room, her heart hammering against her ribs, realizing she had just collided with something entirely out of her control. The open barouche ride through Hyde Park had been a calculated spectacle, Marcus sitting beside her, rigid and imposing, speaking only in low, polite murmurs for the benefit of the staring crowds, the ton gaping, Aunt Constance miraculously cured of her migraine and nearly weeping with triumph. But the true revelation came a week later, not in a carriage, but in the sprawling glass conservatory attached to the rear of Rosemere House. Marcus had invited Eleanor, and ostensibly her aunt, currently asleep on a settee in the main house overwhelmed by the Duke's sherry, to see Julian's domain. The conservatory was massive, a jungle of imported ferns and towering palms. Though the air did not smell of flowers, it smelled of oil, brass polish, and damp earth, and spread across 3 long oak tables were clocks, dozens of them, mantel clocks, carriage clocks, delicate gold pocket watches, heavy iron maritime timepieces, some fully assembled and ticking in a chaotic, unsynchronized chorus, others completely dismantled, their intricate gears and springs laid out on velvet cloths with surgical precision. Julian sat on a high stool at the center table, wearing a leather apron over his shirt sleeves, holding a jewelless loop to his eye, wielding a pair of tiny tweezers with a stillness and focus that completely contradicted his usual restless energy. Eleanor stood beside the table, leaning in close, wearing a simple yellow dress, sunlight filtering through the glass ceiling catching the gold tones in her hair. Marcus stood several feet away, his shoulder against a cast-iron support pillar, watching them both. "This one," Julian said, his deep voice hushed with reverence, carefully lifting a small, intricately carved brass gear with his tweezers. "This is the escape wheel. It makes the ticking sound. It stops the spring from unwinding all at once." "It is so small," Eleanor marveled, not reaching out to touch it, respecting his workspace. "How do you know where it goes?" "I hear it," Julian said simply, removing the loop from his eye to look at her. "When a clock is broken it sounds wrong. The rhythm is sick. I look at the gears until I see the sick part, then I make it healthy." "You are a doctor for timepieces," Eleanor smiled, and Julian liked that, a wide, bright grin breaking across his face. "Yes, a doctor," he said, returning the loop to his eye and bending over the pocket watch. "Marcus broke this one. He dropped it on a rock. He is very clumsy." Eleanor let out a sudden, bright laugh, entirely unpracticed and genuine, and Marcus felt a strange, tight-pulling sensation in his chest as he pushed off the pillar and walked slowly toward the table. "I was thrown from a horse, Julian," Marcus corrected, his voice dry, though the corner of his mouth twitched. The watch was collateral damage. Julian did not look up. "Clumsy." Eleanor looked at Marcus, her eyes dancing with amusement. The harsh, intimidating Duke she had met in her drawing room entirely absent here in the humid air of the greenhouse, looking relaxed, almost entirely human. "I did not realize you had such a destructive streak, Your Grace," Eleanor teased gently. Marcus stopped beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I break many things, Miss Hartley," he said. "My brother is the only one who can put them back together." The words were spoken lightly, but there was a profound, heavy truth beneath them, and Eleanor looked up at him, his dark eyes fixed on Julian's bowed head, his expression unguarded for the first time. "He is brilliant," Eleanor said quietly, making sure Julian, deeply engrossed in his task, could not hear. "They call him simple, but there is nothing simple about this." She gestured to the hundreds of tiny, perfectly organized gears. "He understands systems," Marcus murmured, his gaze dropping to her face. "He understands machines because they have rules. They follow a logic. People frighten him because they are entirely illogical. They smile while they insult you. They offer a hand while holding a knife. He cannot pass the deception." "Can you?" Eleanor asked, holding his gaze. "I assume everyone is holding a knife," Marcus said bluntly. "It saves time." Eleanor felt a pang of deep, unexpected sorrow for him, to live in a state of constant war, forever anticipating the next strike. That must be an exhausting way to live. "It keeps him safe," Marcus replied, his jaw hardening slightly. "But who keeps you safe?" The question slipped out before Eleanor could stop it, too intimate, too direct, and she saw his breath hitch, his eyes snapping to hers, the intensity in them suddenly burning hot. He did not answer immediately, staring at her, dissecting her expression, searching for the pity he despised or the calculation he expected, finding neither, only a quiet, steady understanding. "I do not require safety," Marcus finally said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "Everyone requires safety, Your Grace," Eleanor countered softly, "even if it is only a quiet room where they can drop the armor for an hour." Marcus reached out, the movement slow and deliberate, his large hand hovering over the table, entirely avoiding the clock parts, his knuckles gently brushing against the back of her hand where it rested on the oak wood. The touch was electric, a jolt of heat shooting up her arm, and she did not pull away. "Perhaps," Marcus murmured, his thumb lightly tracing the ridge of her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. "I have just found one." The chaotic ticking of 50 different clocks filled the silence in the greenhouse, but for Eleanor, the only sound in the world was the sudden, deafening rush of her own pulse. The social season was a machine, and machines detested friction. By late June, Eleanor Hartley was no longer a ruined wallflower, she was an anomaly. The Duke of Rosemere had driven her through Hyde Park twice more, sent her aunt a basket of hothouse peaches, stood beside Eleanor at the opera with his massive frame effectively blocking the stairs of the stalls, his attention entirely focused on the stage and the woman beside him, but elevation breeds resentment, and the aristocracy could tolerate a sudden rise in fortune if it was transactional. A young, beautiful girl traded to an old, wealthy lord made sense. The mathematics were sound. But Marcus was young, terrifyingly powerful, and widely considered entirely immune to sentiment, while Eleanor was plain, impoverished, and entirely too blunt, and it did not add up, and society despises what it cannot calculate. The boiling point arrived at the Earl of Brackenridge's summer fete, an outdoor affair sprawled across the manicured lawns of his Richmond estate, the afternoon sun vicious against the striped silk marquees and the agonizingly tight cravats of the gentlemen. Eleanor stood near the edge of the rose garden, a glass of warm lemonade sweating through her silk glove, Aunt Constance having abandoned her to ruthlessly pursue a newly widowed baron near the archery targets. Marcus temporarily delayed in the house, caught in a political conversation he could not simply walk away from without offending a key parliamentary ally. Julian, however, was in the garden, kneeling in the dirt near a massive ancient oak, entirely ignoring the hundreds of aristocrats drinking champagne 50 yards away, entranced instead by a colony of stag beetles, gently shifting leaves with a twig to observe their slow, armored movements, and Eleanor kept her eyes on him, a steady, protective vigilance she had adopted over the last month without even realizing it. An inspiring sight, is it not? A voice said, thin and coated in a sugary veneer that barely concealed the venom underneath, and Eleanor turned to find Lady Ashcombe standing a few feet away, a woman in her late 40s whose sharp, predatory features were heavily powdered to hide the creeping lines of age, and Pemberton's godmother besides. "The roses, Lady Ashcombe?" Eleanor asked mildly. "Yes, the blooms are quite robust this year. I was not referring to the foliage, Miss Hartley." Lady Ashcombe snapped her fan open, the sound like a dry bone breaking, and looked directly at Julian. "I was referring to the spectacle, the Duke's heavy burden, playing in the mud like a feral child." Eleanor's grip on her lemonade glass tightened until her knuckles turned white. "Lord Julian is observing the beetles," she said. "He possesses a remarkably keen mind for the natural world." "He is an idiot," Lady Ashcombe said, dropping the pretense entirely, stepping closer, her cloying, heavy lavender perfume suffocating the smell of the roses. "And you are a remarkably clever little opportunist. Do you think we do not see what you are doing?" "I am standing in a garden, madam. I am not aware of doing anything at all." "You are playing the nursemaid to snare a duchy," Lady Ashcombe hissed, her eyes gleaming with malice. "It is a bold strategy. Pemberton told me how you publicly humiliated him to defend that creature. The Duke is grateful. Naturally, he protects his blood, but do not confuse a bodyguard's gratitude with a man's desire." Eleanor felt a cold, hard knot form in her chest, but kept her face entirely blank. "If you have a point, Lady Ashcombe, I suggest you reach it. The sun is quite hot and your powder is beginning to run." The older woman's eyes flashed with pure, unadulterated hatred. "My point, Miss Hartley, is that the Duke of Rosemere will never marry you. He uses you to pacify his brother. You are a human pacifier, a toy to keep the boy quiet so the Duke can finally have some peace. Once Julian tires of you, or breaks you as he breaks everything, Marcus will cast you aside with a modest pension and a ruined name. You are a temporary convenience." The words hit their mark, striking the very center of Eleanor's own secret, darkest fears, because Marcus was attentive, protective, but he had never spoken of the future, had never crossed the line from terrifying protector to suitor. He had merely placed her in his brother's orbit and guarded the perimeter. Before Eleanor could formulate a response, a sharp, deafening crack split the humid air, down by the river where the Earl of Brackenridge had ordered the early testing of the evening's fireworks display, a rogue mortar misfiring in its tube and detonating on the ground with the concussive force of a cannon shot. The aristocrats on the lawn gasped, a few women dropping their glasses, but from the oak tree came a roar, a terrifying sound tearing through the garden. Julian screamed. It was not a shout of surprise, it was a guttural, primal sound of absolute terror, and he scrambled backward, his large frame thrashing against the roots of the tree, the sudden, violent noise shattering his delicate sensory equilibrium. Eleanor dropped her glass, it shattered on the gravel path, and she shoved past Lady Ashcombe, ignoring the woman's indignant squawk, running toward the oak. "Ollie," she yelled, but Julian did not hear her, his hands clamped brutally hard over his ears, his eyes wide, unseeing, completely consumed by the panic drowning his mind, and he scrambled to his feet, slipping on the damp grass, and bolted, not toward the safety of the house but away from the crowd entirely, plunging blindly into the Earl's massive, towering hedge maze. The entrance swallowed Julian whole, and Eleanor did not hesitate, grabbing the heavy silk skirts of her dress, hauling them up to her knees, sprinting after him, gravel tearing at the thin soles of her slippers, the meticulously trimmed hedges looming 10 feet high on either side, instantly blocking out the sun and plunging the path into a suffocating green gloom. "Julian," she called again, her voice cracking, only the crunch of her own footsteps answering her. The maze was designed to disorient, the paths branching widely, twisting back on themselves in tight, claustrophobic angles, and she took a left, then a right, stopping to strain her ears over the ragged sound of her own breathing, until a heavy thud echoed from somewhere to her right, the sound of a large body hitting the tightly woven branches. Eleanor ran, tearing through the paths, ignoring the sharp twigs that snagged her sleeves and scratched her forearms, not caring about the mud ruining her hem, not caring about the scandal of a woman running unaccompanied through a labyrinth, caring only about the terrified boy trapped inside his own mind, and she rounded a sharp corner and stopped dead. It was a dead end, and pressed into the darkest corner, huddled against the unyielding wall of thorns, was Julian, made as small as possible, his knees pulled tight to his chest, his arms wrapped around his head, rocking back and forth in a frantic, jerky rhythm, muttering a rapid, unbroken stream of syllables that made no sense, entirely lost to the panic. Eleanor approached slowly, knowing better than to touch him now. A sudden touch would feel like an attack, and she dropped to her knees in the dirt, her silk skirts pulled through the mud, ignoring it entirely, placing her hands flat on the ground in front of her, making herself small, unthreatening. "Julian," she said, keeping her voice low, steady, the exact tone she had used on the ballroom floor. He did not stop rocking, did not open his eyes. Loud, too loud, it broke. The sky broke. "The sky did not break, Julian," Eleanor said softly. "It was only powder, fire powder. It is gone now." "Broken, broken, Marcus, Marcus," his voice hitched into a sob, a grown man, massive and strong, weeping with the unadulterated terror of an abandoned child, and Eleanor felt a physical ache in her chest, reaching into the pocket of her ruined dress, her fingers brushing against the small, cool metal object she had carried with her every day since their afternoon in the greenhouse, a cheap brass pocket watch she had bought from a street vendor for 3 shillings, one that did not keep perfect. Time but ticked loudly, and she pulled it out, holding it by its short chain, letting it dangle a few inches from her knee, saying nothing, letting the heavy, rhythmic tick-tick-tick cut through the damp silence of the dead end. 10 seconds passed, then 20. Slowly, agonizingly, the frantic rocking began to slow. Julian's muttering quieted, his broad shoulders hitched one last time, and he cracked open one eye, peering through the tangled mess of his dark hair, his gaze locking onto the swinging brass watch as the fading light caught its casing. Tick, tick, tick. "Is it broken?" Julian whispered, his voice raw. "No," Eleanor said, her voice a calm, anchoring tether. "It is working perfectly, the escape wheel is healthy, listen to the rhythm." Julian lowered his arms, leaning forward, his entire focus narrowing to the cheap brass casing, the logic of the machine, the predictable, mathematical certainty of the gears, pushing back the chaotic terror of the sudden noise. "It is a cheap watch," he said, his breathing finally beginning to even out. "The gears are rough, they drag." "They do," Eleanor agreed, "but they keep moving, they don't stop." Julian reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and did not take the watch from her, simply placing his large hand over hers, holding her fingers steady so he could press his ear closer to the casing, closing his eyes, the tension melting out of his massive frame as he exhaled a long, shuddering breath. "Healthy," he murmured. At the entrance to the dead end, a shadow fell across the gravel. Eleanor looked up. Marcus stood there, looking as though he had run the entire way from the main house, his pristine cravat torn open, his chest heaving, sheer panic etched into the hard lines of his face, a man who had stared into the abyss. He had heard the explosion, torn through the crowd demanding to know where his brother was. Someone had pointed toward the maze, and he had systematically ripped through the hedges, fear a cold blade against his throat, expecting to find Julian broken, expecting a disaster, and instead finding his brother sitting quietly in the dirt, anchored by a cheap brass watch, his hand resting gently over Eleanor's. Marcus stared at the woman kneeling in the mud, her hair falling out of its pins, her face smudged with dirt, her expensive silk dress ruined beyond repair, and she was the most beautiful, devastating thing he had ever seen in his life. Lady Ashcombe's poisonous words echoed in Eleanor's mind as she looked up at him. You are a human pacifier, a temporary convenience, but looking at Marcus now, she did not see a man using her, she saw a man whose walls had just entirely collapsed. He did not speak, stepping into the clearing, dropping to his knees in the mud beside them, and pulling his brother into a crushing embrace. Julian stiffened for a second before wrapping his massive arms around Marcus, burying his face in his brother's shoulder. I have you, Ollie, Marcus whispered fiercely, his voice cracking. I have you. Eleanor quietly let go of the watch, leaving it in Julian's palm, and stood up, brushing the worst of the mud from her skirt, feeling intrusive suddenly, witnessing an intimacy born of decades of survival, and she turned to walk away, to give them the privacy of the dead end, but before she took 2 steps, a hand clamped around her wrist, the grip ironed tight, entirely unrelenting. Eleanor looked back. Marcus was still on his knees, one arm around his brother, but his other hand was wrapped around her wrist, anchoring her to the spot, and he looked up at her, his dark eyes burning with an intensity that made the air in the maze feel thin. He did not say a word. He did not need to. The desperate, bruising grip on her wrist communicated everything. Do not walk away from me. Do not ever walk away. The Hartley drawing room was cloaked in the heavy shadows of late evening, Aunt Constance mercifully absent, having retired upstairs with a glass of brandy after the exhausting, scandalous events of the afternoon. Eleanor sat in the worn armchair by the unlit fireplace, bathed, changed into a simple, faded cotton wrapper, hollowed out and entirely drained of adrenaline. When the knock came at the front door, it was not the authoritative, booming strike of a duke, it was quiet, 2 firm, deliberate taps. Mary, the maid, had already gone to bed. Eleanor stood, her bare feet silent on the floorboards, and walked into the narrow hallway, unlocking the heavy oak door and pulling it open. Marcus stood on the stoop, no carriage waiting in the street. He had walked, discarding his formal coat and cravat, wearing only a white linen shirt open at the collar and dark trousers, looking stripped down, divested of the title and the terrifying armor that came with it. He did not ask for permission, stepping over the threshold and closing the door quietly behind him, and the small hallway suddenly felt suffocatingly intimate. Ollie is asleep, Marcus said, his voice low, rough with exhaustion. I sat with him until the watch you gave him lulled him down. He placed it under his pillow. I am glad, Eleanor said, crossing her arms over her chest, suddenly feeling very exposed in her thin cotton wrapper. He recovers quickly when the noise stops. Marcus did not look at the faded wallpaper or the worn rug, he looked only at her, stepping closer. I spoke with Lady Ashcombe before I left the fete, he said, his tone turning dangerously soft. Eleanor stiffened. Did you? Yes, she was quite eager to tell me she had warned you about my intentions, informed me that you were visibly upset when she explained I was merely using you to manage my brother. Marcus stopped a foot away from her, the heat radiating off his large body chasing away the chill of the evening. And what did you say to her? Eleanor asked, her voice tight. Nothing, Marcus replied. I simply informed the Earl of Brackenridge that if Lady Ashcombe was ever invited to another event in London, I would purchase the debt on his estate and evict him by morning. Eleanor's breath hitched. You cannot keep ruining people who insult me. There will be no one left in London. I do not give a damn about London, he growled, closing the remaining distance between them, not touching her, but so close she had to tilt her head back to look at his face. I give a damn about what you believed. Did you believe her? Eleanor looked into his eyes and saw the fear there, the raw, bleeding fear of a man who had never trusted another human being in his life, offering his throat to a blade. I was afraid she was right, Eleanor admitted, her voice dropping to a whisper. I am nothing, Marcus, I have no name, no money, I am entirely illogical to a man like you, and you guard Julian so fiercely, it made sense that you would hire a guard dog. Marcus closed his eyes, a sharp, ragged breath escaping his lips, and when he opened them again, the cynical Duke of Rosemere was entirely gone. I am a selfish, ruthless bastard, Eleanor, he said, his voice shaking with a terrifying vulnerability. "I have spent my entire life building walls thick enough to keep the wolves away from my brother. I assumed everyone was a wolf. Then you stepped onto that ballroom floor, ruined your dress, and walked right through the stone." He finally raised his hands, not grabbing her, reaching out with excruciating slowness instead, his large, calloused palms cupping her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheekbones. "I am not using you to pacify him," Marcus whispered, leaning down until his forehead rested against hers. "I am terrified of you because before you, if I fell, only Julian suffered. Now if I fall, I lose everything. You are the only thing in my life that I did not calculate. You are the only thing I want." The cold knot in Eleanor's chest dissolved, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming rush of heat, the logic of the ton, the whispers, the lack of a dowry, all of it burning away under the desperate honesty in his voice. "Then stop calculating," Eleanor whispered, reaching up, tangling her hands in his thick, dark hair, and pulling him down. The kiss was not polite, not the chaste, practiced press of lips the ton approved of. It was a collision, and Marcus groaned, a deep, primal sound in the back of his throat, wrapping his massive arms around her waist and hauling her flush against his chest, kissing her with a starving, desperate intensity, pouring years of contained isolation into the slide of his mouth against hers. Eleanor met him entirely, kissing him back with a fierce, grounding certainty, anchoring him just as she anchored Julian, not with pity, but with an unyielding strength that finally allowed him to stop fighting. When they finally broke apart, breathing heavily, Marcus kept his arms locked around her, resting his chin atop her head, eyes closed. "Marry me," he murmured into her hair, and it was not a request, it was a surrender. "On one condition," Eleanor replied, her voice muffled against his chest. Marcus pulled back slightly, looking down at her with a raised brow. "Name it." "Julian builds the clocks for Rosemere House," she said, a small, genuine smile curving her lips. "All of them. I want to hear the ticking." Marcus stared at her for a long moment, and then, for the first time since she had met him, the Duke of Rosemere threw his head back and genuinely, freely laughed, a rich, deep sound that shook the dust in the narrow hallway. "No," Eleanor corrected softly, resting her hand over his heart, beneath her palm the erratic hammering rhythm of his pulse finally beginning to settle into a slow, steady, healthy beat. "It will just be entirely on time." If this story of a broken duke, his gentle brother, and the one woman brave enough to love them both stayed with you, you already know why Regency romance readers cannot get enough of enemies to lovers dukes, found family healing arcs, and slow-burn historical love stories like this one. So if you loved watching a ruined wallflower bring a formidable duke and his overlooked brother into the light, like this video, share it with someone who adores grounded, emotional romance, and subscribe so you never miss the next full romance audiobook story. Drop a comment below telling me your favorite moment between Eleanor and Julian, and I will see you in the next story.